Today, we are cracking open one of the most blistering critiques of democratic government ever written. We're talking about H.L. Mencken's 1926 classic, Notes on Democracy.
So Mencken kicks things off not with a fiery attack, but with this really quiet, almost gentle image. He's suggesting that the idea of democracy didn't, bubble up from the streets in a revolution. Nope. He says it was more like a pleasant tune, drifting down from on high. And then, boom, he pulls the rug out from under us. For Mencken, that whole idyllic origin story, that sweet music, was a complete fantasy, something cooked up by thinkers who were totally disconnected from the real world.
Okay, so if the call for democracy didn't actually come from the people, then where did it come from? And that brings us to his first big point. This was an idea, a theory, imposed from the top down.
Mencken argues that this whole thing started in the heads of elite philosophers. They dreamed up this perfect, romanticized vision of the common person, what Rousseau called the noble savage, someone pure and uncorrupted by civilization. And they just decided, without any real proof, that this person was naturally good and wise.
In this quote right here, it just perfectly captures the paradox that Mencken found so completely absurd. He's saying the whole theory of democracy was built on this, magical idea that being at the bottom of the social ladder somehow makes you the most qualified to rule from the very top.
But what about the actual people down at the bottom? What did they really want? This is where Mencken draws a really sharp, cynical line between the lofty theory and what he saw as the grim reality of what he calls the mob's true desires.
Now we've got to pause here for a second and get his language right. When Mencken uses the word the mob, he's not just talking about an angry crowd with pitchforks. It's his sweeping and, a very unflattering term for the entire mass of voters in a democracy.
So while the intellectuals were up in their ivory towers debating these abstract ideas like liberty and justice, Mencken claims the average person wanted something way, way simpler. Their goals were concrete, they were materialistic, just a better, easier life, not a whole new political philosophy.
And for his Exhibit A in this whole argument, he points directly at the absolute chaos of the French Revolution. For him, this was the ultimate proof of that massive disconnect between the ideal and the real.
This line is so central to what he's arguing. He's basically saying, look, the moment the common man was supposedly freed, he showed zero interest in governing himself. He killed the king, sure, but then he immediately turned on the very revolutionaries who led him, and in the end, welcomed a new, even stronger master.
So, if the people themselves didn't really want these democratic ideals, how in the world did these ideas become so powerful? For Mencken, the answer was a kind of slow, creeping infection that he called the plague of rhetoric.
What a vivid image, right? He's picturing the language of democracy, all the speeches, the pamphlets, the big theories, as a kind of disease slowly seeping down from the intellectuals and infecting the minds of everyone else, generation by generation.
So let's actually trace this timeline that Mencken lays out. It starts in 1793 with the French Revolution, which he saw as a violent rejection of these new ideas. But then, a few decades later, around 1828 in America, he says the idea starts to stick. This whole notion of the common man's special wisdom. Fast forward to 1848, and these ideas are spreading like wildfire across Europe. And by 1867, Mencken says it hits its final form, the belief that the world belongs only to the workers, that they alone have the right to rule. It's a slow burn, but it happens over nearly 100 years.
And here we have it, the ultimate transformation. What were once just simple, basic wants, more food, less work, were now dressed up in the noble language of intrinsic and natural rights. And at the very same time, the desires of the old elite were knocked down and labeled as nothing more than ignominious lusts.
So, this whole historical process, in Mencken's view, eventually hardened into the unquestioned beliefs of his day, what he calls democracy's modern dogma.
He boils the entire democratic faith down to these two core principles. First, the idea that the masses have an absolute, God-given right to govern themselves. And second, and this is the real kicker, that they are actually competent enough to do it well. For Mencken, these weren't just ideas. They were treated like sacred, unchallengeable truths.
Now, what's really fascinating is his take on how this dogma defends itself. He saw this perfectly circular logic. If the people make a foolish decision, well, it's never their fault. They were just misinformed. And what's the solution?
more democracy, more education. If they act badly, well, that's just a natural reaction to being oppressed. The solution? You guessed it, more democracy. Any failure of the system just becomes an argument for more of the same.
And that brings us to our final thought. Mencken laid out this incredibly controversial, and let's be honest, for many people deeply offensive critique almost 100 years ago. And it really forces us to ask a tough question. When you look at the world around us now, which parts of his argument, if any, still seem to echo in our own political realities today?